Mars in the 12th house, the war beneath the surface. Welcome to Mars in the 12th house in Synastry. In this overlay, we explore what happens when one person's Mars falls into another person's 12th house, the house of the unconscious, hidden life, solitude, spiritual depth, self-undoing, and everything that exists beneath the threshold of ordinary perception and beyond the reach of ordinary social accountability. This is the final placement in the Mars series, and in many ways the most complex, the most psychologically consequential, and the most difficult to see clearly from the inside. It does not operate through the body, as the first house does. It does not operate through daily friction or public competition, as the 6th and 10th do. It operates beneath all of these, in the layer of experience that exists below conscious awareness, in the domain where things are felt rather than seen, where patterns establish themselves without either person fully knowing that they are doing so, and where the damage that Mars can cause, when it causes damage here, is among the most difficult to name, to locate, and therefore to address. Mars in the 12th house is Mars operating in the dark, and a malefic operating in the dark is, in the precise and literal sense of that phrase, the most serious configuration this series has encountered. The 12th house governs the unconscious in its fullest and most encompassing sense, the vast interior terrain that exists beneath the surface of waking life and that shapes everything that happens above the surface in ways that are rarely fully visible to the person living within it. It is the house of what has been hidden, what has been surrendered, suppressed, or simply never brought into the light because the light was never quite safe enough to bring it into. It is the house of solitude and withdrawal, of the places in life where a person retreats from the world in order to be alone with whatever the world does not see. It is the house of spiritual experience in its most genuine and demanding form, of the dissolution of the ordinary ego in the encounter with something larger and less personally manageable than the self. And it is the house of self-undoing, of the patterns, often unconscious and often rooted in the distant past, through which a person participates in their own suffering without fully knowing that they are doing so. In traditional astrology, the 12th house carries one of the most consistently difficult reputations in the entire chart. It is a cadent house, and specifically the most aversive of the cadent houses, positioned in such a way that it cannot see the ascendant at all, completely cut off from the chart's primary point of embodied selfhood. Traditional sources associated it with enemies who operate in secret rather than openly, with places of confinement and withdrawal, with illness of the kind that is chronic and difficult to diagnose, with grief, with exile, and with the things a person loses through their own actions without fully understanding why they have lost them. It was called the House of Bad Spirit, a designation that carries real weight and that encodes something genuine about the nature of 12th house experience. It is the part of life that does not see itself clearly, that operates in peripheral vision rather than direct gaze, that is most vulnerable precisely because its vulnerabilities are least available to conscious examination. Mars here, a malefic planet of force, aggression, and the direct application of pressure, operating in the most hidden and least accountable house in the chart, is a configuration that requires more honest and careful examination than almost any other in synastry. Whatever Mars does in the 12th house, it does in a domain where neither person can see it clearly. Whatever patterns it establishes beneath the surface of conscious relational life. And whatever harm it causes, when it causes harm, it causes in the place where the house person is most undefended, least able to identify what is happening, and least equipped to seek help from the outside world that cannot see what is occurring in the hidden interior of the relationship. From the Mars person's perspective, the house person provokes something that operates below the level of ordinary conscious experience, something that the Mars person may not be able to fully account for or articulate, even to themselves. There is often a quality of compulsion in the Mars person's attraction to the house person that is unlike the more straightforward desire of the 1st or 5th house overlays. The Mars person is drawn to the house person in a way that feels urgent and not entirely explicable, pulled toward the house person's depth, their mystery, their quality of interiority, with an appetite that has something restless and unresolved at its center. The Mars person may feel that the house person reaches something in them that has never quite been reached before, something old and not entirely comfortable that the house person's presence activates without either person being entirely sure what it is. The Mars person in this overlay may also find that the house person brings out impulses and emotional responses that are surprising in their intensity. Anger that seems disproportionate to its apparent trigger, desire that has an edge of something more than simple attraction, a quality of psychological urgency in the relationship that feels less like ordinary human connection and more like the surfacing of something that has been waiting, unresolved, for a long time. The 12th house has a way of drawing out what is unconscious, and Mars drawn out from the unconscious is not always a Mars that presents itself in forms that are either recognizable or easy to manage. From the house person's perspective, the Mars person's energy arrives in the most hidden and least defended domain of their existence. This is a profoundly significant event, and not always a comfortable one. The house person may feel the Mars person's presence in their 12th house as a force that operates beneath the surface of ordinary awareness, not always visible in the way that Mars in the 1st or the 7th is visible, but felt nonetheless, in a register that is deeper and more essential than conscious experience and harder, for that reason, to assess clearly or to respond to effectively. The house person may experience the Mars person as someone who seems to understand something about them that they have never managed to articulate, who perceives and responds to the most hidden and most private dimensions of the house person's interior life with a directness and an intensity that can feel, initially, like a profound and almost miraculous recognition. The 12th house yearns in its own quiet way to be seen, and Mars arriving here with its characteristic force and directness can feel, in the early stages of the relationship, as though the most essential and most private self has finally been encountered by someone capable of meeting it with full presence and genuine appetite. What the house person may take longer to recognize is that the Mars person's access to their 12th house is not the same as the Venus person's access in the earlier series. Venus in the 12th arrives in that hidden domain with tenderness, with compassion, with a quality of gentle illumination that loves what it finds there. Mars arrives with force, with the pressing, penetrating energy of a planet that does not naturally pause to consider whether the territory it is entering has consented to the entry, or whether the pace and force of that entry is genuinely in service of the person whose most undefended interior it is now occupying. At its most constructive, Mars in the 12th house can produce a relationship with a genuine quality of psychological activation, one in which the Mars person's energy, pressing against the house person's unconscious, brings hidden material to the surface in ways that, when both people have the capacity to work with what emerges, are genuinely transformative. The 12th house contains what has been suppressed, old angers, unresolved wounds, fears that have never been brought into daylight because the daylight was never quite safe enough. Mars arriving here can function, at its most productive, as a force that refuses to allow those suppressions to remain undisturbed, that presses on the locked doors of the house person's unconscious with a persistence that, when it is met with genuine care and psychological awareness, produces a liberation of material that the house person genuinely needed to encounter. There is also a spiritual dimension to this overlay at its most elevated expression. The 12th house is the house of spiritual experience, of the dissolution of the ordinary ego in the encounter with something larger and less personally bounded than the self. Mars here, in its most evolved form, can function as a spiritual catalyst, a force that presses the house person beyond the comfortable limits of the ego self and into a more genuinely surrendered and spiritually open mode of existence. The relationship may have a quality of spiritual urgency, a sense that what is happening between these two people is not merely personal, but part of a larger process of psychological and spiritual development that neither person could have initiated alone. This overlay can also produce a relationship with a genuine quality of private passion, a connection that exists in the interior of both people's lives with an intensity that the public world never quite sees or understands. The 12th house is inherently private, and Mars here generates a passionate energy that belongs to the hidden dimension of the relationship rather than its social surface. This private passion can be among the most intensely felt experiences in either person's relational life, a connection that operates at depth, that has a quality of necessity and urgency that more surface-level relationships cannot produce, and that remains, long after the relationship itself has changed or ended, a presence in the house person's unconscious that does not easily or quickly dissolve. The shadow dimension of this overlay is where the full and unsparing weight of Mars's malefic nature in the 12th house must be addressed. And it must be addressed with a directness and a completeness that this particular configuration demands. Because what is at stake here is not merely relational friction or professional damage, or even the domestic danger of the 4th house, serious as that is. What is at stake in the 12th house is the house person's mental health, their psychological integrity, and in the most serious expressions of this overlay, their fundamental sense of reality and safety within their own inner life. Mars in the 12th house, operating without awareness or restraint, does not produce its damage openly. This is the critical and defining feature of this placement's shadow dimension, and it is what makes it, in some ways, the most insidious of all the difficult Mars overlays. In the 1st house, Mars's aggression is visible. It arrives at the body, in the personal encounter, where it can at least be seen and named. In the 4th house, domestic violence is a recognizable form of harm, with an established social understanding of what it is and how it operates. In the 7th house, the adversarial dynamic is open. Both people know they are in conflict, and the outside world can observe the contest. But in the 12th house, Mars operates in the hidden interior, in the domain that is by definition cut off from ordinary visibility, that exists behind closed doors in the most complete and most psychologically essential sense. The harm that occurs here occurs where no one can see it, often including the house person themselves, whose 12th house is precisely the domain in which their capacity for clear self-perception is most limited. The specific forms that Mars's destructive expression takes in the 12th house are worth naming individually and without evasion. The first is covert aggression, the expression of Mars's force not through open confrontation, which the social world might witness and respond to, but through hidden channels, passive aggression, psychological manipulation, the use of the house person's unconscious vulnerabilities that the Mars person has been given access to precisely because the 12th house opened them, as instruments of control. The Mars person in this overlay knows things about the house person's inner life that the house person may not fully know about themselves. That knowledge, wielded destructively, becomes a tool of psychological coercion that operates entirely beneath the surface of the relationship's visible presentation. The second is the activation of the house person's self-destructive patterns. The 12th house is the house of self-undoing, of the unconscious mechanisms through which a person participates in their own suffering. Mars here, when it is operating at its most difficult, does not merely bring its own aggression into the house person's unconscious, it activates the house person's existing self-destructive tendencies, pressing on old wounds in ways that cause them to reopen and bleed, reinforcing patterns of self-negation or self-harm that the house person may have been in the process of healing, and creating conditions in which the house person's own unconscious becomes a source of renewed suffering rather than a terrain of potential integration and growth. The mental health implications of this overlay at its most difficult must be stated directly and without softening. Mars in the 12th house, when it is operating destructively, is associated with a genuine deterioration of the house person's psychological well-being, with anxiety that has no clearly identifiable source, with depression rooted in the unconscious processing of a relational dynamic that cannot be clearly seen or named, with a quality of psychological destabilization that the house person may struggle to attribute correctly because the Mars person's force is operating in a domain that is, by definition, below the level of clear conscious awareness. The house person may know that something is deeply wrong without being able to say what it is, may feel increasingly unmoored from their own inner life without understanding why, may find that their psychological resources, their capacity to think clearly and to trust their own perceptions, are being gradually depleted by a dynamic they cannot fully see. Abuse in this overlay, and the word must be used because it belongs to the honest account of what Mars's most destructive expression in the 12th house can produce, is abuse that operates in the hidden interior of the relationship, that leaves no marks visible to the outside world, and that the house person may struggle to identify as abuse precisely because it occurs in the domain where their own clarity of perception is most compromised. Gaslighting, the systematic undermining of the house person's grip on their own reality, is a form of harm particularly associated with 12th house dynamics, because the 12th house is already a domain of uncertain perception and blurred boundaries between inner and outer reality. Mars in the 12th, at its most destructive, exploits that uncertainty with a ruthlessness that is all the more effective for being invisible. The distinction between the constructive and the destructive expressions of this overlay rests, more than in any other placement in this series, on the question of consciousness, specifically on the degree to which the Mars person is genuinely aware of the force they are bringing into the house person's most undefended interior, and genuinely committed to wielding that force with care, with reverence for the trust that the 12th house's opening represents, and with a genuine orientation toward the house person's psychological growth and well-being, rather than toward the satisfaction of the Mars person's own unconscious needs and unresolved psychological material. Mars in the 12th is, in the most precise sense, a placement that requires the Mars person to do their own psychological work, to bring their own unconscious patterns, their own unresolved angers and wounds and drives into conscious awareness, because in the 12th house, the unconscious material that the Mars person has not examined will express itself in the relationship regardless. And in the house person's most undefended terrain, the consequences of that unexamined material are the most serious the Mars series has to offer. At its highest expression, Mars in the 12th house creates a relationship of profound psychological and spiritual depth, one in which both people are genuinely and lastingly changed by the encounter, in which hidden material is brought into the light with genuine care and genuine courage, and in which the force that Mars brings into the house person's unconscious is a force genuinely in service of liberation rather than of control. The Mars person, operating at their most evolved, becomes a genuine catalyst for the house person's psychological integration, pressing on what has been suppressed with enough care and awareness to make the surfacing of that material an experience of growth rather than of violation. The house person gives the Mars person's energy its most demanding and most spiritually significant direction, a depth of encounter that requires Mars to develop in order to meet it with genuine adequacy, qualities that do not come naturally to it. Patience, psychological awareness, genuine humility before the complexity of another person's unconscious life. When balanced, Mars in the 12th house creates psychological activation, spiritual depth, the courageous surfacing of hidden material, and a relationship in which both people are made more genuinely and more fully themselves through the sustained and careful encounter with what each carries in the most hidden rooms of their interior life. When imbalanced, it produces covert aggression, the activation of self-destructive patterns, the systematic erosion of the house person's psychological stability and grip on their own reality, and, at its most damaging, a hidden and sustained psychological violence that operates in precisely the domain where the house person is least able to see it clearly and least equipped to defend against it. This overlay, of all the placements in this series, is the one that most demands that both people bring genuine consciousness, genuine psychological honesty, and genuine commitment to each other's well-being into the relationship, not occasionally, not performatively, but as a sustained and active practice. Because in the 12th house, what is unconscious does not stay unconscious. It finds expression. The only question that finally matters in this placement, is whether what finds expression through the Mars person's force in the house, person's most hidden and most essential interior, is something that illuminates what it encounters, or something that, in the dark where no one is watching, consumes it.
Thank you for listening. This was Mars in the 12th house, and the conclusion of the Mars in the House's Synastry series.